The moment Colt Merrick's boots hit the dust of Birch Hollow, three men reached for their guns. He wasn't supposed to survive the ride into town, not with a price on his head and a past soaked in blood. But Rosalind Hayes stood on that porch anyway, waiting for the mail-order husband she'd sent for, even as the sheriff whispered he'd be dead by sundown. What happened next would either destroy this quiet Montana town or prove that even the wildest heart could find redemption. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind carried dust and secrets across the Montana Territory that September morning in 1884, and both settled heavy on the shoulders of Colt Merrick as he guided his stallion down the main street of Birch Hollow. He'd ridden through worse towns, meaner towns, towns where a man's life wasn't worth the bullet it took to end it. But something about this place made his jaw tighten and his hand drift closer to the Colt revolver at his hip. Maybe it was the way the morning sun painted everything gold and innocent, like God hadn't heard about what men like him did in the darkness. Maybe it was the children playing marbles outside the general store, their laughter cutting through the air clean and pure. Or maybe it was the fact that somewhere in this picture-perfect slice of civilization, a woman named Rosalind Hayes was waiting for him, and he had no goddamn idea why. The letter was folded in his shirt pocket, creased and worn from 3 months of hard writing. He'd read it so many times the words had burned themselves into his memory. Seeking a strong man of good character for marriage and companionship. Widowed schoolteacher, age 28, no children. Must be willing to settle in Birch Hollow, Montana Territory, and live a respectable life. No drunks, gamblers, or men running from the law. Colt had smiled at that last part, a bitter, knowing smile that never reached his eyes. Then he'd written back anyway, lying through his teeth about everything except his name and his ability to work hard. What did he have to lose? Another winter sleeping rough, another year of looking over his shoulder, another town where people spat when he walked by. At 32, he'd lived enough for 3 lifetimes, and most of it had been hell. If some lonely schoolteacher wanted to give him a chance at something different, he'd take it, even if he didn't deserve it, especially because he didn't deserve it. But riding into Birch Hollow that morning, watching curtains twitch and faces appear in windows, Colt realized he'd made a fundamental miscalculation. This wasn't just a town. It was a community, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where reputations mattered and strangers were examined like specimens under glass. And he was about as welcome as a rattlesnake in a cradle. The first man to confront him was dressed in a black suit that had seen better days, a silver star pinned to his vest that caught the sunlight. Sheriff, then. Colt had developed a sixth sense for law enforcement, could spot them in a crowd blindfolded just by the way they carried themselves. That particular blend of authority and suspicion that came from having to keep order in places where chaos was always one drink away. You'd be Merrick. It wasn't a question. The sheriff stood in the middle of the street, hand resting casual-like on his gun belt, but his eyes were hard as flint. Colt Merrick, the man Miss Hayes sent for. Colt reined in his horse, taking his time about it. Never good to show you were in a hurry. Never good to let them see you sweat. That's right. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, gravelly from days without much use. Got business here? That depends. The sheriff took a step closer, and Colt noticed 2 other men drifting out from the sides of buildings, armed, watchful, ready. We take care of our own in Birch Hollow. Miss Hayes, she's one of our own, respected. Her late husband was the minister here before fever took him 3 years back. Good man, Thomas Hayes. Left mighty big shoes to fill. The implication hung in the air between them like gun smoke. And you're not fit to fill them. Wasn't planning on filling anyone's shoes, Sheriff. Just my own. Colt kept his hands visible, both on the reins, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. He'd been in this situation before. Outnumbered, outgunned, with men looking for an excuse to put him down. The smart play was to back down, apologize, maybe ride on to the next territory. But Colt Merrick had stopped making smart plays about the same time he'd stopped believing in second chances. Until 3 months ago, anyway. Thomas! The voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter, feminine, clear, with an edge of steel that made even the sheriff turn. Thomas Hendricks, you step away from that man right now. She came down the steps of the mercantile like a force of nature, and Colt forgot to breathe. Rosalind Hayes wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. not like the painted ladies he'd known in saloons, all rouge and practiced smiles. She was something else entirely. Tall, nearly 5'8", with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that somehow emphasized the elegant line of her neck. Her dress was simple gray cotton, appropriate for a schoolteacher, but she moved in it like a queen in royal robes, and her eyes, Christ, her eyes, dark brown, almost black, and so direct they seemed to see straight through all the lies he'd told himself about why he'd come here. "Miss Hayes," the sheriff's tone shifted, became almost gentle. "We're just making sure—" "Shh, I know exactly what you're making sure of, and I appreciate your concern." She stopped a few feet away, her gaze moving from the sheriff to Colt and back again. "But Mr. Merrick is my guest, and I'll thank you to let him pass." "Rosalind," the sheriff shook his head. "You don't know this man. We don't know anything about him except what he wrote in a letter. Could be anybody, could be dangerous." "Then I suppose I'll have to take that risk, won't I?" She turned to face Colt fully, and he felt the weight of her assessment like a physical thing. "Mr. Merrick, I'm Rosalind Hayes. Welcome to Birch Hollow." He should have said something smooth, something that would put her at ease and convince the sheriff he wasn't a threat. Instead, what came out was, "Ma'am, your sheriff's right. You don't know me. Maybe you should get down off that horse and let me make my own decisions about who's dangerous and who's not." She said it matter-of-factly, without anger, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "I've been making my own decisions for 3 years now, gentlemen, and I don't intend to stop just because the situation makes some people uncomfortable." The sheriff opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed like a man who knew when he was beaten. "Your funeral, Rosalind. But don't come crying to me when what, Thomas? When I find out that a man who's traveled 800 miles to answer a letter might actually be exactly what he claimed to be? When I discover that not everyone with a hard past is irredeemable?" She softened slightly, touched the sheriff's arm. "I know you're trying to protect me. I know you all are. But I wrote that letter because I was tired of being protected. I wanted a partner, not another keeper." The words hit Colt like a fist to the gut. He'd come here expecting desperation, a woman so lonely she'd take anyone, even a man like him. But standing there watching her face down the sheriff and the armed men behind him, he realized Rosalind Hayes wasn't desperate at all. She was brave, maybe too brave for her own good. He dismounted slow and careful, keeping his movements predictable. The horse, a red roan gelding he'd won in a card game 2 territories back, stood steady. At least the animal had more sense than he did. "Sheriff!" Colt nodded once, respectful but not submissive. Then he turned to Rosalind and swept his hat off, dust swirling around his boots. Up close she was even more striking, fine bones, a mouth that looked like it smiled often, and those eyes that seemed to catalog every scar, every hard mile, every sin he'd committed. "Miss Hayes, I appreciate you standing up for me. But your sheriff's not wrong to be cautious. I'm not—" He paused, searching for words that weren't lies but wouldn't damn him either. "I'm not the kind of man you're used to in a place like this." "Good." She said it simply, then smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "If I wanted what I was used to, Mr. Merrick, I would have married any of the 3 men in this town who've been proposing to me every Sunday after church for the past 2 years. I wanted something different. Now, are you going to stand there looking dangerous, or are you going to come see your new home?" Behind them, the sheriff muttered something that sounded like a prayer for patience. Several women who'd gathered across the street whispered furiously to each other, their faces scandalized. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll, marking the hour. Colt Merrick, who'd killed his first man at 17 and hadn't stopped looking over his shoulder since, put his hat back on and followed Rosalind Hayes down the main street of Birch Hollow. He had no idea what he was walking into, but for the first time in 15 years, he felt something uncomfortably close to hope. The house was smaller than he'd expected, a neat 1-story structure on the edge of town, with a garden that had clearly been loved once but had gone a bit wild. Roses tangled up the side of the porch, and someone had planted herbs in an organized chaos near the door. The whole place smelled like lavender and possibility. "It's not much," Rosalind said, leading him up the steps. "Thomas built it himself before we were married. After he died, I couldn't bear to change much, but there's room enough for 2, if we're both willing to make adjustments. She pushed open the door, and Colt stepped into a world that felt like it belonged to someone else. Books everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, piled next to a worn armchair by the fireplace. A piano in the corner, sheet music scattered across its top. Lace curtains that filtered the sunlight into something soft and golden. It was a home in every sense of the word, and Colt had never felt more like an intruder. "Mr. Merrick?" Rosalind was watching him, her head tilted slightly. "Are you all right?" "I don't belong here." The words came out before he could stop them. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you did back there, standing up to the sheriff and all. But look at this place. Look at you, and then look at me. This was a mistake. Sit down." It wasn't a request. She pointed to the armchair, then moved to a cabinet and pulled out 2 glasses and a bottle of what looked like whiskey. "We need to have a conversation, and you look like you could use a drink. It's not even noon. Mr. Merrick, I just publicly defied the sheriff and half the town to claim you as my intended husband. I think I'm entitled to a drink before noon." She poured 2 generous measures, handed him one, then sat in the chair opposite his. "Now, let's be honest with each other, shall we? Because that letter you sent me was very polite and very proper and very much complete horseshit." Despite everything, Colt almost smiled. "Ma'am, Rosalind, we're either going to be married or not, but either way, you can call me by my name." She took a sip of her whiskey without flinching. "I'm not stupid, Mr. Merrick. I taught school in Chicago before I married Thomas. I've seen enough of the world to know that men who write perfect letters about settling down and living respectable lives don't usually have eyes like yours. Like they've seen the worst humanity has to offer and decided to keep going anyway." "Then why'd you tell me to come?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the whiskey forgotten in his hand. "Why put yourself in this position?" "Because I'm 28 years old and I'm tired of being alone." She said it without shame, without apology. "Because this town is full of good men who want to marry the memory of Thomas Hayes's widow, not the actual woman I am. Because I'm tired of being treated like fine china, too delicate to touch, too precious to risk breaking." She met his eyes. "And because your letter, for all its lies, had one line that rang true. You wrote, 'I'm not a good man, but I'm trying to be better.' That's all I wanted, Mr. Merrick. Someone who's trying." The church bell had stopped ringing, and in the silence that followed, Colt could hear children playing somewhere in the distance, the sound of a wagon rumbling past, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business. He thought about the life he'd left behind, the guns, the running, the nights waking up expecting to find a knife at his throat. He thought about the last man he'd killed 2 years ago in a saloon in Wyoming, and how he'd sworn afterward that he was done, that he'd find a way to stop being what the world had made him. "I've done things," he said quietly, "bad things, the kind of things that don't wash off no matter how far you ride." "I assumed as much." Rosalind took another sip of whiskey. "Are you running from the law?" "No, not anymore." It was technically true. The bounty had been lifted 6 months ago, the charges dropped when witnesses recanted. But there were other kinds of law, other kinds of debts that didn't disappear just because a judge changed his mind. "Are you wanted for murder?" "I've killed men." He watched her face, waiting for the horror, the disgust, the fear. "Some of them needed killing, some of them didn't. I'm not sure I can tell the difference anymore." "Were you a soldier?" "No, ma'am. Just a man who made bad choices early and kept making them." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, studying him like one of her books, trying to understand the story between the lines. Finally, she said, "My husband Thomas was a good man, a truly good man, the kind who believed in redemption and second chances and the inherent worth of every soul. He would have welcomed you here, I think, seen something in you worth saving. And you?" Colt's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "What do you see?" "A man who rode 800 miles to keep a promise to a stranger. A man who just told me the truth when lying would have been easier. A man who looks at my home like it's something sacred he's afraid to touch." She set down her glass and leaned forward. "I see someone who's tired, Mr. Merrick. Bone-deep tired of running and fighting and surviving. And I hope, that maybe we can both stop being so tired together." Outside, voices rose in the street, The sheriff's deputies, still watching, still waiting for him to prove them right. Colt thought about leaving, about climbing back on that roan gelding and riding until Birch Hollow was just another town in his past. It would be easier, safer, for both of them. But then Rosalind Hayes reached across the small space between their chairs and held out her hand, palm up, an offer and a challenge, all at once. "Stay," she said simply. "Stay and be better. That's all I'm asking." Colt looked at that outstretched hand, small, fine-boned, with ink stains on the fingers from years of grading papers and writing lessons. It was the hand of a woman who'd built a life out of words and knowledge and hope, and he was a man whose hands were stained with things that didn't wash away. But he took it anyway. The next week passed in a haze of awkwardness and adjustment. Birch Hollow, it turned out, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Colt Merrick's arrival had given them enough to talk about for months. He moved into the small room at the back of Rosalind's house, technically the study, but she'd cleared out space for a bed and called it his until the wedding. If there was a wedding. "People are talking," she told him matter-of-factly the third morning as they shared coffee on the porch. "Apparently Mrs. Garrison saw you chopping wood yesterday without your shirt on and nearly fainted." Colt paused mid-sip. "It was 90 degrees. "Yes, well, in Birch Hollow, men keep their shirts on even when it's 90 degrees. Or at least they do if they don't want to scandalize the local widows." She was smiling, though. That slight upturn of her mouth that he was learning meant she found the whole thing ridiculous, but was too polite to say so directly. "Should I apologize to Mrs. Garrison?" "God, no. The poor woman hasn't had that much excitement in years. Let her have it." Rosalind set down her cup and turned to face him. "But speaking of excitement, we need to discuss expectations." "All right. The wedding is in 3 weeks. I've already spoken to Pastor Williams, not Thomas's replacement, but close enough. He's agreed to perform the ceremony, though he did feel obligated to lecture me about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of knowing one's husband before entering into holy matrimony." She rolled her eyes, as if I hadn't been married before and didn't know exactly what I was getting into. "And what are you getting into?" Colt asked. "With me? I don't know yet." She said it honestly, without pretense. "You're quieter than I expected, more careful. You fix things around the house without being asked, and you read my books when you think I'm not looking. You're kind to the neighbor's dog, even though it keeps stealing your breakfast scraps. But you also jump every time someone comes to the door, and you sleep with your gun under your pillow, and sometimes I catch you looking at the horizon like you're calculating how fast you'd need to ride to outrun whatever's chasing you." Colt felt something in his chest tighten. "Does that scare you?" "A little," she admitted. "Not because I think you'll hurt me, but because I'm afraid whatever you're running from will catch up, and I'll lose you before I even really have you." It was the most honest conversation they'd had since he'd arrived. Colt set down his own cup and stood, leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the town that still didn't trust him. "There's a bounty," he said finally. "Or there was. Got lifted 6 months ago, but not everyone got the message. Some folks might still be looking." "What was the bounty for?" "Horse theft, stage robbery, assault." He rattled off the charges like reading a shopping list. "I was 17 when I fell in with the wrong crowd. By the time I realized how deep I was in, there wasn't a way out except through. So I went through. Took me 15 years to get clear." "Did you do those things? The theft and robbery and assault?" "Some of it. Not all. But enough." He turned to look at her. "I'm not going to lie to you, Rosalind. I'm not going to pretend I was some innocent kid who got caught up in circumstances beyond his control. I made choices, bad ones, and people got hurt because of those choices." "Are you still making those choices?" "No, ma'am. Haven't for 2 years now. But that doesn't change what I did." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm them, even though the morning was already heating up. Finally, she said, "My father was a drunk, beat my mother until she stopped fighting back, then started in on me and my sisters. Everyone in our neighborhood knew, but nobody did anything because he was a respected businessman and she was just his wife. When I was 16, I took my sisters and we ran. Lived in a church basement for 6 months until I was old enough to get work as a teacher's assistant. Colt stared at her, this woman who'd seemed so composed, so untouched by the ugliness of the world. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. She stood and came to stand beside him at the railing. We all have things in our past that shame us, things we'd change if we could. But the past is just that, past. What matters is what we do now, today, with the life we have left. She touched his arm, gentle. Can you be faithful to me, if we marry? Can you stay here in this town and build a life without running? I can try. It was all he could promise, and they both knew it. Then that's enough. She squeezed his arm once, then released him. Now come with me. There's someone you need to meet. The someone turned out to be Rosalind's classroom. A dozen children ranging from 6 to 14, all staring at him with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion as Rosalind led him through the door. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure near the church, one room with benches and a blackboard and windows that let in the morning light. It smelled like chalk and children and the particular kind of hope that came from learning. Class, Rosalind said, her voice taking on a different quality, firmer, more authoritative. This is Mr. Merrick. He'll be helping around the school for the next few weeks. I expect you to treat him with the same respect you show me. A small hand shot up in the back. Is it true he's a gunfighter, Miss Hayes? Benjamin. Rosalind's tone could have frozen water. Where did you hear that? My pa said, well, your pa shouldn't be gossiping where little boys can hear. She turned to Colt. Mr. Merrick, would you like to address the question? Put on the spot, Colt cleared his throat. Every eye in the room was on him, and he felt more nervous than he had facing down the sheriff and his deputies. I know how to use a gun, he said carefully. Most men out here do, but I'm not a gunfighter, just someone who's trying to live a quieter life. Another hand. Can you teach us to shoot? Absolutely not. Rosalind cut in before Colt could respond. Mr. Merrick is here to fix the broken desks and help with the heavy work, not to turn my students into outlaws. Now, everyone take out your slates. We're working on multiplication tables. The collective groan was universal, and despite everything, Colt found himself smiling. He spent the morning doing odd jobs around the schoolhouse, fixing a loose window, replacing boards on the porch, chopping wood for the stove they'd need come winter. And he watched Rosalind work, marveling at how she commanded that room full of children with nothing but her voice and her presence. She was patient with the slow learners, firm with the troublemakers, and genuinely delighted when someone grasped a difficult concept. This was her calling, he realized. This was where she came alive. At lunch, the children spilled out into the yard, and Rosalind came to find him behind the woodpile. You're good with an axe. Had practice. He sank the blade into the stump he'd been using as a chopping block. Your students are terrified of you. Good. Fear's an excellent motivator for learning arithmetic. But she was smiling. What do you think? I think you're wasted on this town. The words came out before he could stop them. You should be teaching at a university somewhere, Boston or New York, somewhere that would appreciate what you can do. Rosalind looked surprised, then pleased, then sad. Thomas used to say the same thing, but this is my home now. These children need someone who believes in them, who sees past the limitations of a frontier town and shows them there's a whole world of knowledge waiting. She paused. Besides, if I left, who would keep the widow Garrison from having heart palpitations over shirtless men? He laughed, actually laughed, a sound that felt rusty and strange coming from his throat. Point taken. Walk with me? She held out her arm, formal as a lady at a ball, and after a moment's hesitation, Colt took it. They strolled around the edge of the schoolyard, and he was aware of every eye watching them from the windows of town. The teacher and the stranger, the widow and the wild man, the whole town holding its breath to see how this story would end. I'm going to disappoint you, he said quietly. Eventually, I'm going to do something, or say something, or be something that makes you realize you made a mistake. Probably. Rosalind's honesty was startling. And you'll probably be disappointed in me too. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I read too much, and I have very strong feelings about the Oxford comma. We'll fight, we'll frustrate each other. That's what happens when two people try to build a life together. Then why do it? She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. In the midday sun, her eyes were the color of strong coffee, warm and deep. Because the alternative is spending the rest of my life alone. And I've discovered I'm not very good at alone. Because you make me laugh, and that's harder than it sounds. And because when you look at me, you see me, not Thomas's widow, not the respectable schoolteacher, just Rosalind. And that's rarer than you might think. Colt wanted to kiss her then, standing there in the schoolyard with half the town watching. Wanted to pull her close and promise her things he had no business promising, forever and safety and a life without fear. But he was still learning how to be the kind of man who could make those promises and keep them. So instead, he just said, "I see you," and hoped it was enough. That night, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Rosalind was grading papers, her pencil scratching across the slate, occasionally making small sounds of approval or dismay. Colt was cleaning his gun, carefully, methodically, the way his father had taught him before the world went sideways. "Tell me about him," Rosalind said suddenly. "Thomas, your late husband." She looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because he was part of your life, part of who you are. And if I'm going to marry you, I should know about the man who came before me." Rosalind set down her pencil, considering. "Thomas was kind," she said finally. "Deeply, fundamentally kind in a way that seemed almost miraculous out here. He believed the best of people, even when they didn't deserve it. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, never made me feel small or stupid or less than." She paused. "He was also predictable. Safe. I always knew exactly what he was thinking, what he wanted, what he'd say in any given situation. And I loved him for that. I did. But sometimes..." She trailed off. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes I wanted to surprise him, shock him, make him see me as something other than his sweet, proper wife." She laughed softly. "Isn't that terrible? He was everything a woman could want, and I was ungrateful enough to want more." "That's not terrible." Colt reassembled his gun, the movements automatic. "That's human." "Is it?" She looked at him, really looked. "You're not like him at all, you know. Where he was steady, you're stormy. Where he was certain, you're full of doubt. Where he brought peace, you bring, I don't know, chaos, maybe. Possibility. Sounds exhausting." "It is." But she was smiling. "It's also exhilarating. I feel more alive in your presence than I have in years. More myself. Does that make sense?" "Yeah." He holstered the gun. "It does." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars come out one by one. And somewhere in that silence, Colt Merrick made a decision. He couldn't promise her forever. Didn't know if he'd live long enough to make good on that kind of promise. But he could promise her today, and tomorrow, and every day after that, for as long as fate allowed. It wasn't much. But maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The first real trouble started on a Tuesday, exactly 11 days after Colt Merrick rode into Birch Hollow. He was in the mercantile picking up supplies, flour, coffee, nails for the fence he was mending around Rosalind's garden, when he heard the voices from the back room. Low, urgent, the kind of conversation men had when they didn't want to be overheard. "I'm telling you, I recognize him. Saw his face on a wanted poster down in Cheyenne 2 years back. Colt Merrick, wanted for robbery and worse." "That bounty was lifted, Martin. I checked with the marshal's office myself." That was Sheriff Hendricks sounding tired. "Whatever he did, the charges were dropped." "Charges being dropped don't make a man innocent, Tom. Just means someone couldn't prove it or got paid off. You really want Rosalind Hayes hitching herself to that?" Colt stood very still, holding a bag of flour in one hand and a tin of coffee in the other. He could leave. Should leave. Walk out right now and avoid whatever confrontation was brewing. But something, pride maybe, or the bone-deep weariness of running, kept him rooted in place. "What I want," the sheriff said slowly, "is for folks in this town to mind their own business and let Rosalind make her own choices. She's a grown woman, Martin. She's a widow who don't know any better. Someone's got to protect her from herself. And you figure that someone is you?" There was an edge to Hendrick's voice now, sharp enough to cut. "Martin, you've been sniffing around Rosalind for 2 years, and she's turned you down every time. This ain't about protecting her. This is about you being sore that she chose someone else." The silence that followed was dangerous. Colt set down the flour and coffee quietly, his hand drifting toward his hip before he remembered he'd left his gun at home. Rosalind's house, he corrected himself. Not home? Not yet. Maybe never. You calling me jealous, Sheriff? I'm calling you transparent. Now you got actual evidence that Merrick's done something wrong here in Birch Hollow. You bring it to me. Otherwise, leave the man alone. Footsteps. Heavy ones, coming toward the front of the store. Colt had just enough time to step back and pretend he'd been examining the selection of hammers when Martin Garrett emerged from the back room, a thick-set man with a red face and the kind of eyes that held grudges. Their gazes met, and Garrett stopped dead. You. Me. Colt kept his voice level, non-threatening. Years of practice had taught him how to de-escalate, when to fight and when to fold. Just picking up some supplies. I bet you are. Settling in real nice, aren't you? Making yourself comfortable in a dead man's house with his widow. Garrett took a step closer, and Colt could smell whiskey on his breath, even though it wasn't yet noon. Well, let me tell you something, Merrick. We don't take kindly to drifters around here, especially ones with your kind of reputation. Martin. Sheriff Hendricks appeared in the doorway, hand on his gun belt. That's enough. Is it? 'Cause seems to me someone should say what needs saying. This man's got no business here, got no business with Rosalind Hayes, and if he had any decency at all, he'd climb back on that horse and ride out before he brings whatever trouble he's carrying down on this whole town. Every word was a gut punch, and the worst part was that Garrett wasn't wrong. Colt had been telling himself the same things since he arrived. But hearing them spoken out loud, in front of the sheriff and old Mrs. Chen who ran the mercantile and whoever else was listening from behind the dry goods, it crystallized something inside him, made him realize that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, some people would always see him as the sum of his worst moments. You're right, Colt said quietly, and watched surprise flicker across Garrett's face. I don't have any business here. No ties to this place, no history, no claim except a letter and a promise. And maybe that's not enough. Maybe I am just bringing trouble to your town. He paused, meeting Garrett's eyes steadily. But Rosalind Hayes asked me to stay, and until she tells me different, that's what I'm going to do. Even if it gets her killed? Garrett's voice rose. You think those bounty hunters won't come looking? You think they'll care that some school teacher got in the way? The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Colt felt ice run through his veins because that was the fear he'd been carrying since the moment he'd decided to answer Rosalind's letter, that his past would catch up and hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone good, someone like her. There are no bounty hunters, Sheriff Hendricks said firmly. The charges were dropped, the bounty lifted. Martin, you're working yourself up over nothing. Am I? Then why's he still looking over his shoulder? Why's he sleep with his gun under his pillow? Garrett smiled, ugly and triumphant. Yeah, I asked around. Mrs. Pemberton does your laundry, Merrick. She's seen that gun, seen you check the windows every night before you go to bed. That's not the behavior of an innocent man. Colt wanted to argue, to defend himself, to point out that 15 years of running didn't just disappear because some judge somewhere decided to drop charges. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Men like Garrett had already made up their minds. I'll take my supplies, he said instead, moving toward the counter where Mrs. Chen was watching with wide eyes. And then I'll be on my way. Colt. The sheriff's use of his first name made him pause. Don't let Martin get in your head. He's just saying what everyone's thinking. Colt pulled coins from his pocket, counted out the exact amount for his purchases. It's all right, Sheriff. I'm used to it. He gathered his supplies and walked out into the bright morning sunlight, feeling the weight of eyes on his back. The town was watching. The town was always watching. And he was starting to understand that no matter what he did, no matter how many fences he fixed or how politely he tipped his hat to the ladies, some folks would always see him as an outsider, a threat, a mistake Rosalind Hayes had made that they'd all pay for eventually. He was halfway back to the house when he heard footsteps behind him, quick, light, distinctly feminine. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. I heard what happened at the mercantile, Rosalind said, falling into step beside him. Mrs. Chen's daughter came to the school specifically to tell me. Apparently, the whole town knows by now. I'm sorry. For what? You didn't do anything wrong. She reached out and touched his arm, making him stop and face her. They were standing in the middle of the street, and Colt was acutely aware of curtains twitching in windows, of people pretending not to watch while watching intently. Martin Garrett is a bitter man who can't accept that I never wanted to marry him. His opinion means nothing to me. But he's not wrong. The words came out harsher than intended. About the bounty hunters. About me bringing trouble. Rosalind, I've been thinking… No. She said it firmly, the same tone she used with students who were about to make a poor decision. Whatever you're about to say, no. If you're thinking about leaving, about running again because Martin Garrett said some hateful things, then you need to stop thinking that right now. It's not just Garrett, it's everyone. The way they look at me, the way they whisper. You deserve better than this. Better than what? Better than a man who keeps his promises? Who works hard and reads my books and makes me laugh? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Colt, I knew this wouldn't be easy. I knew the town would talk, would judge, but I chose you anyway. Don't I get a say in this? Of course you do, but nothing. She grabbed his hand right there in the street where everyone could see and held on tight. I'm tired of people telling me what I should want, who I should be with, how I should live my life. I'm tired of being protected and managed and treated like I don't have sense enough to make my own decisions. So if you want to leave, if you've decided you can't do this, then say so. But don't leave because you think it's better for me. Let me decide what's better for me. Colt looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused, hers small but strong, ink-stained and capable. He thought about all the reasons he should walk away, all the ways this could end badly. And then he thought about the alternative. Another town, another alias, another lifetime of looking over his shoulder and sleeping with one eye open. I don't know how to do this, he admitted quietly. Be someone's husband, build a life. I'm going to mess it up. Probably. She smiled. And I'll mess it up too. But we'll mess it up together. That's the deal. Some deal. Best one I've got. She squeezed his hand once more, then released it. Now come on. I need you to help me move some desks at the school, and then we're having dinner with Pastor Williams so he can give us his premarital lecture about the sanctity of marriage and our duties to God and each other. Sounds like a party. Oh, it'll be excruciating. But afterward, we can sit on the porch and you can tell me more about your life before Birch Hollow. The real story this time, not the edited version. Colt hesitated. You sure you want to hear it? I'm sure I need to hear it. All of it. Because if we're going to do this, really do this, then we can't have secrets between us. She started walking toward the school, and after a moment, he followed. Besides, I've been married before. I know that the fantasy version of a person never matches the reality, and I'd rather know the real you than spend the rest of my life with a stranger. The afternoon passed in a blur of physical labor and uncomfortable conversations. Pastor Williams turned out to be a severe man with wire-rimmed glasses and very strong opinions about the roles of husband and wife, most of which seemed to involve Colt being the spiritual head of household while Rosalind submitted gracefully to his authority. Rosalind listened with a serene expression that Colt was learning meant she was grinding her teeth internally and planning to completely ignore everything being said. And of course, the pastor continued, warming to his theme, a wife's primary duty is to her husband and the children God will bless you with. The school is all well and good, but once you're married, Rosalind, your focus must shift to the home. Fascinating, Rosalind said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Mr. Merrick, what do you think about my teaching? Colt, who'd been trying to tune out the lecture, looked up. Ma'am, do you expect me to give up teaching once we're married? It was a trap. He could feel it, but he also knew the truth wouldn't get him out of it. I expect you to do whatever makes you happy. Teaching's important to you. I wouldn't ask you to stop. Pastor Williams' expression suggested Colt had just committed some kind of theological heresy. Mr. Merrick, surely you understand the biblical model of marriage. With respect, Pastor, I don't know much about biblical models of anything. Colt leaned back in his chair, meeting the older man's disapproving gaze. But I know Rosalind's good at what she does. Those kids need her, And seems to me that using the gifts God gave you, if you believe in that sort of thing, is more important than following someone else's idea of how you should live. The silence that followed was profound. Pastor Williams opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Rosalind with something like pity. Well, I can see the two of you have much to discuss. Perhaps we should reconvene when you've had time to pray about the proper structure of Christian marriage. After he left, Rosalind burst out laughing, a real, full-throated laugh that transformed her whole face. Oh my God, did you see his expression? I thought he was going to spontaneously combust. I probably shouldn't have said that about biblical models. No, you absolutely should have. She was still grinning. Do you know how long I've wanted to say something like that to him? 3 years, Colt. 3 years of listening to him lecture me about my duty and my place and how I should be grateful for the protection of a good man. And you just... She made a gesture like an explosion. Perfect. So we're not getting married by Pastor Williams? Hell no, I'll find someone else. Maybe the circuit preacher when he comes through next month. Or we'll go to the next town over, I don't care. She grabbed his hand again, that quick, impulsive gesture he was starting to recognize. Thank you for understanding about the teaching. Thomas always said it was fine, but I could tell he thought I'd give it up eventually. Have babies and stay home and be a proper minister's wife. Did you want babies? The question came out before he could stop it. Too personal, too intimate. But Rosalind didn't flinch. I did. Do. Maybe. I don't know anymore. She looked away, out the window where children were playing in the street. Thomas and I tried for 3 years. Nothing ever took. The doctor said it was probably me, something about my anatomy being inhospitable. She said the word like it tasted bitter. Thomas was kind about it, said God had other plans for us, but I could see the disappointment. I'm sorry. Don't be. I've made peace with it. And honestly, the idea of trying again, of going through that hope and disappointment every month, she shook her head. I'd rather focus on the children I can help through teaching. At least then I know I'm making a difference. Colt wanted to tell her that it wouldn't be like that with him, that there'd be no disappointment, no pressure. But the truth was he had no idea what kind of husband he'd be. Hell, he barely knew what kind of man he was anymore, stripped of the violence and running that had defined him for so long. That evening, true to her word, Rosalind made him tell her everything. They sat on the porch as the sun set, and he talked, really talked, for the first time in years, about his father, a Texas rancher who'd drunk himself to death when Colt was 15, about his mother, who'd remarried within 6 months to a man who made it clear Colt wasn't welcome, about leaving home at 16 with nothing but a horse and his father's gun, and falling in with a gang of outlaws who seemed like family until they weren't. The first man I killed was in self-defense, he said, staring out at the darkening sky. He was going to shoot my friend Jesse over a card game that went bad. I didn't even think about it, just pulled my gun and fired. He was dead before he hit the floor. Rosalind was quiet, listening without judgment. Jesse thanked me, said I'd saved his life, made me feel like a hero instead of a killer. Colt's laugh was bitter. After that, it got easier. Every time we robbed a stage or hit a bank, every time someone drew on us, I told myself it was necessary, self-defense, survival. But the truth is I got good at it, the killing, and part of me liked being good at something, even if that something was wrong. How many? Rosalind asked quietly. Men I've killed? 7, maybe 8. There was one I'm not sure about, down in Arizona. Shot him, but he might have survived. He finally looked at her, expecting horror or disgust. Instead, he found only steady attention. Does that change things, knowing the number? I don't know. She was honest, at least. Ask me again in a month, a year, after I've had time to reconcile the man sitting on my porch with the one you're describing. They're the same man, Rosalind. Are they? She tilted her head, considering. Because the man I know fixes fences and reads poetry and helps children with their arithmetic. The man you're describing sounds like someone else entirely. Someone you used to be. You don't just stop being that person. It's not that simple. No, she agreed. But you can become someone else in addition to who you were. Both things can be true at the same time. She stood, brushing off her skirt. It's late. We should go inside. But as she passed his chair, she paused and rested her hand on his shoulder, A simple touch that felt like absolution he didn't deserve. Thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy. Are you scared? He had to know. Of me? Rosalind was quiet for a long moment. A little, she finally admitted, but not because I think you'll hurt me. I'm scared that one day something will happen that brings that other man back. That I'll wake up and the Colt I know will be gone, replaced by someone I don't recognize. That's a reasonable fear. I know, but I'm also scared of spending the rest of my life alone. And I'm scared of dying without ever taking a real risk, without ever choosing something wild and dangerous and possibly foolish. She smiled, sad and beautiful. So I guess we'll just have to be scared together. The next week passed in tense normalcy. Colt worked on repairs around town, not because anyone asked, but because it gave him something to do with his hands and kept him visible. He figured if people saw him every day, saw him working hard and keeping to himself, maybe they'd start to trust him. It was a naive hope, but it was all he had. On Friday, he was replacing boards on the church steps when he heard the horses. 3 riders coming in fast from the east, dust rising behind them like smoke. Every instinct Colt had developed over 15 years screamed danger. He stood slowly, hand drifting toward his hip before remembering again that he'd left his gun at home. Stupid. He'd gotten soft, comfortable, exactly what he'd sworn he wouldn't do. The riders pulled up in front of the saloon and Colt got his first good look at them. Hard men, all 3, with the lean, hungry look of wolves. The kind who rode from town to town looking for trouble or profit, whichever came first. The lead rider was tall, maybe 6'2", with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who knew he was dangerous and didn't care who knew it. Colt's blood ran cold. He knew that scar, knew that face. Jake Hollis. They'd ridden together once 7 years ago, before Colt had enough sense to get out. Before he'd realized that men like Jake didn't just break the law, they enjoyed it, fed on it, got a taste for violence that could never be satisfied. Well, well, Jake's voice carried across the street, loud enough for everyone to hear. If it ain't Colt Merrick, heard you were dead. Not yet. Colt stayed where he was, on the church steps, very aware of the townspeople starting to gather. Sheriff Hendricks was coming out of his office, hand on his gun. This was about to go bad in about 6 different ways. Shame about that bounty getting lifted. Jake walked closer, his 2 companions fanning out behind him. Would have been a nice payday, but then I got to thinking, maybe there's other ways to profit from an old friend. We're not friends, Jake. No? Jake's smile was all teeth. Funny, 'cause I remember us being real close. Remember that bank in Kansas, the one where you shot the teller? The lie was smooth, practiced, and absolutely devastating. Colt felt the mood of the crowd shift immediately, heard the gasps, saw Sheriff Hendricks' hand tighten on his gun. That's not how it happened. Isn't it? See, my memory's pretty clear. You went in first, gun drawn. Teller reached for something, maybe a weapon, maybe not, and you shot him, killed him dead. We took the money and ran, and you kept right on riding with us for another 2 years. The charges were dropped. Colt's voice was steady, but his heart was racing. All of them, including that one. Sure they were. Question is, does this nice little town know why they were dropped? Does your pretty school teacher know what kind of man she's planning to marry? Jake looked around at the gathering crowd, playing to them like an actor on a stage. See, I'm what you might call a concerned citizen. Come to warn you good people about the snake you're about to welcome into your midst. That's enough. Sheriff Hendricks stepped forward, hand still on his gun. You've said your piece, now you can ride out. Or what, Sheriff? You'll arrest me for telling the truth? Jake's expression was pure innocence. I'm just trying to help. Civic duty and all that. The truth. Rosalind's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She was standing on the porch of the Mercantile, still in her teaching clothes, her face pale but determined. You want to talk about truth? Let's talk about why you're really here. Jake turned to her, his smile widening. And you must be the widow, prettier than I expected. Got a taste for dangerous men, do you? I've got a taste for honesty. She came down the steps, moving to stand beside Colt. And you're lying. I don't know why, but you're lying. Am I? Jake pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, unfolded it with exaggerated care. Got a copy of the charges right here. Bank robbery, Kansas City, 1879. Teller name of Marcus Webb, shot and killed during the commission of said robbery. 3 men involved, including one Colt Merrick. Charges, dropped. Colt bit out each word. Because witnesses recanted. Funny thing about witnesses, they can be persuaded to change their stories if the price is right, or if they're threatened. Jake's eyes glittered. But I was there, Merrick. I know what really happened, and I'm thinking maybe this town should know too. The crowd was murmuring now, voices rising. Colt could see belief settling over them like a fog, the confirmation of everything they'd feared, everything Martin Garrett had been saying. He was dangerous, a killer, a mistake that would destroy them all. How much? Rosalind's voice was cold. Jake blinked. Ma'am? How much is it going to cost to make you go away? Because that's why you're here, isn't it? Not to warn us, not out of civic duty. You want money, so name your price. Rosalind, Colt started, but she cut him off with a look. How much? Jake studied her for a long moment, then laughed. Smart woman. $500, and I ride out and never mention Kansas City again. That's extortion, Sheriff Hendricks said. That's business. Jake shrugged. And it's a fair price for peace of mind, wouldn't you say? $500, and this nice town doesn't have to worry about what kind of man they're harboring. I don't have $500, Rosalind said. Then I guess we have a problem. Jake's smile never wavered. Because I've got a powerful urge to share my story. Maybe with the territorial marshal, maybe with the newspapers. Hell, maybe I'll just stand in the middle of your town square and tell anyone who'll listen about Colt Merrick and his violent past. Colt felt something snap inside him, not into violence, but into a terrible clarity. This was always how it was going to end. He could run from town to town, change his name a dozen times, try to be better, but men like Jake would always find him, would always use his past as a weapon, and people like Rosalind would always get caught in the crossfire. I'll go with you, he said quietly. Everyone turned to stare. Rosalind's hand found his arm, gripping tight. What? I'll go with you, Colt repeated, looking at Jake. Out of town, right now, and you leave these people alone. Colt, no. It's the only way, Rosalind. He gently removed her hand from his arm, though it killed him to do it. He's not going away. And even if we pay him, there'll be someone else. There's always someone else. So you're just going to run? Again? Her voice broke on the last word. I'm going to do what I should have done from the start. Keep my trouble away from people who don't deserve it. He looked at Sheriff Hendricks. I'm sorry. You were right to be suspicious. Don't do this. Rosalind grabbed his arm again, both hands this time. Colt, please. We can fight this. We can... There's nothing to fight. He made himself look at her, made himself see the tears starting to form in her eyes, the devastation on her face. It would be easier if he could hate her, if he could convince himself she was better off. But he couldn't. She was brave and brilliant and deserved so much more than a man who'd bring criminals to her door and danger to her town. You were right before, about me bringing trouble. I'm sorry I didn't listen. He turned to Jake. Give me 10 minutes to get my horse. Take your time. Jake was grinning now, triumphant. We're not in any hurry. Colt walked past the crowd, past the sheriff, past Martin Garrett, whose expression was a mix of satisfaction and something that might have been regret. He didn't look back at Rosalind. Couldn't. If he looked back, he might not have the strength to leave. And leaving was the only way to keep her safe. He was throwing his belongings into his saddlebag when she found him. He'd known she would, should have moved faster. You're a coward. She stood in the doorway of his room, her whole body shaking with fury. You're a coward and a liar, and I was wrong about you. You're probably right. Don't. She moved into the room, grabbed the shirt he was folding, and threw it across the floor. Don't you dare agree with me. Don't you dare make this easy. Rosalind, you told me you'd stay. You promised me you'd try. And at the first sign of trouble, you're running, just like you've always run. This isn't the first sign of trouble. This is proof that I'll never be free of my past, that anyone who stands next to me is in danger. He forced himself to meet her eyes. I care about you too much to let that happen. You care about me. She laughed, sharp and bitter. You care about me, so you're leaving. Do you hear how insane that sounds? It's the truth. The truth is you're scared. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell lavender and chalk dust. You're scared of staying, scared of building something real, scared that maybe I'm right and you can be more than what you were. So you're using Jake Hollis as an excuse to do what you wanted to do all along, run away before you have to risk anything real. The words hit like bullets, and Colt had to look away. That's not fair. No? Then stay. Face this. Face Jake and his lies and whatever else comes. But do it here, with me, instead of alone. Her voice softened. Please, Colt. Don't make me beg. For one perfect moment, he almost said yes, almost dropped the saddlebag and pulled her into his arms and promised never to leave. But then he thought about Jake's face, about the violence simmering behind that smile, about what men like that were capable of when they didn't get what they wanted. I can't. He picked up his bag. I'm sorry. He pushed past her, out the door, into the afternoon sunlight that felt too bright and too harsh. Jake and his men were waiting by the horses, and the whole town had gathered to watch Colt Merrick leave the same way he'd arrived, alone, unwanted, with nothing but a horse and the weight of his past. He was swinging up into the saddle when he heard her voice one last time, clear and strong, despite the tears he could hear beneath it. If you ride out of here, Colt Merrick, don't come back. He didn't answer, didn't trust his voice. Just touched his hat brim once, a gesture of respect or goodbye or apology, he wasn't sure which, and turned his horse east, following Jake Hollis out of Birch Hollow and back into the life he'd never really escaped. Behind him, Rosalind Hayes stood alone on her porch, watching the man she'd chosen ride away. And around her, the town whispered and judged and ultimately felt vindicated in their suspicions. They'd been right all along. Men like Colt Merrick didn't change. They just pretended to, until the pretending got too hard and they showed their true colors. Only Sheriff Hendricks, watching the dust settle on the road, wondered if maybe they were wrong. If maybe what they'd just witnessed wasn't a man showing his true colors, but a man making the hardest choice of his life because he thought it was right. But he kept that thought to himself. In Birch Hollow, there was no profit in being charitable to men who left good women standing alone. They rode for 3 hours before Jake Hollis finally spoke. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Montana landscape in shades of amber and shadow. And Colt had spent every minute of that ride calculating angles and distances and the odds of surviving what he knew was coming. You got soft, Merrick. Jake's voice carried across the space between their horses, casual as commenting on the weather. Never thought I'd see the day when Colt Merrick would ride out just because some woman told him to stay. Where's your pride? Colt didn't answer. He was watching Jake's companions, 2 men he didn't recognize, which meant they were newer recruits to whatever enterprise Jake was running these days. The one on the left was young, maybe 20, with nervous hands that kept drifting to his gun. The other was older, harder, with the flat eyes of a man who'd done things that couldn't be undone. That one would be the real problem if this went sideways. You even listening to me? Jake pulled his horse closer, close enough that Colt could see the scar tissue pulling at his eye. I'm trying to have a conversation here. What do you want, Jake? What do I want? Jake laughed. Well, that's a better question than you know. See, I was serious about that $500. Would have been real nice to have. But watching you squirm back there, watching that school teacher's face when you chose to leave with me, he shook his head, grinning. That was almost payment enough. So we're done then. You got what you came for. Not quite. Jake's smile widened. See, there's something you should know about Kansas City. About Marcus Webb, the teller who got shot. Colt's hands tightened on the reins. What about him? He lived. Jake said it simply, watching for Colt's reaction. Bullet went clean through his shoulder. He was back at work within 3 months. Charges got dropped because there was no murder, just robbery and assault. And you weren't even the one who shot him. I was. The words hung in the air between them, and Colt felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. You're lying. Am I? Think about it, Merrick. Really think about it. You remember going into that bank first? And God help him, Colt did remember. remembered Jake pushing him through the door, remembered the confusion and the gunfire and the blood. He'd assumed it was him who'd pulled the trigger, had carried that weight for 7 years, because Jake had told him it was, because in the chaos of the moment, he hadn't been sure. And after, when the bounty came down listing him as the shooter, he'd believed it, had let it become part of his story, part of the litany of sins that defined him. Why? The word came out rough. Why let me think I killed him? Because guilty men are easier to control. Jake's voice was matter of fact, almost bored. As long as you thought you had blood on your hands, you'd do what I said. Stay with the gang, pull your weight. You were useful, Merrick. Good with a gun, better with horses. I needed you compliant. You son of a... Easy now. The older man had moved his horse closer, hand resting on his gun. No need for violence. Colt forced himself to breathe, to think. 7 years. 7 years he'd been carrying the weight of a death that never happened, a sin that wasn't his. And Jake had let him, had used it to keep him in line, to make him believe he was beyond redemption. So what now? Colt asked. You tell me this just to twist the knife? To show me I gave up everything back there for nothing? No. Jake's expression turned serious. I tell you this because I need something from you. A job. One last job and then we're square. You do this for me and I'll ride back to Birch Hollow and tell everyone the truth about Kansas City. Tell them you're not the killer they think you are. Hell, I'll even tell them about the bounty being a mistake. Give you back your clean slate. What kind of job? The kind you're good at. Jake pulled a folded paper from his pocket. There's a payroll coming through next week. Army money heading from Fort Benson to Fort Shaw. 3 guards, maybe 4. Should be easy for men with our experience. No. Colt said it without hesitation. I'm done with that life. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you don't have much choice. You go back to Birch Hollow now, you're still the man who ran. Still the coward who left his woman standing alone. But you do this job, let me clear your name, and maybe, just maybe, you can go back with your head held high. Tell her the truth about Kansas City. Build that quiet life you want so badly. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. The chance to undo the damage he'd done, to prove to Rosalind and the town that he wasn't what they thought. But Colt had been down this road before, had made deals with men like Jake, and learned the hard way that they never ended clean. And if I say no, Jake's smile vanished. Then I ride back to Birch Hollow and tell them a different story. Tell them about the other jobs we pulled, the ones where people actually did die. Tell them about Texas, about the family we robbed, about the father who tried to protect his wife and daughters and caught a bullet for his trouble. Colt's blood ran cold. I wasn't there for that. Weren't you? Jake leaned back in his saddle. You sure about that? Because I remember differently. And so will the law, when I tell them. Might even be a new bounty in it. Money's always useful. You'd lie to the territorial marshal? Risk bringing the law down on yourself just to spite me? I'd do a lot worse than that. Jake's voice dropped, became something dangerous. You left the gang without permission, Merrick. Just up and disappeared one day, left the rest of us to deal with the fallout. You owe me, and one way or another, I'm going to collect. They stared at each other across the space between horses, and Colt saw his future branching in 2 directions, both of them leading through darkness, but only one offering a glimpse of light at the end. He could refuse, right away, keep running. But Jake would follow through on his threats, would destroy any chance Colt had of returning to Birch Hollow, any chance of rebuilding what he'd thrown away. Or he could do the job. One last crime, one last sin to add to the pile. And maybe, earn the redemption Jake was offering. When? The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Jake's grin returned. That's my boy. Knew you'd see reason. Payroll moves out Tuesday. We hit them Wednesday morning, out in the canyon between the forts. Quick and clean. And afterward? You keep your word? Have I ever lied to you? Jake asked, and Colt almost laughed at the audacity of it. This man who'd just admitted to manipulating him for years, who'd let him believe he was a killer, was now asking for trust. But what choice did he have? Fine, Colt said. One job, then we're done. Then we're done, Jake agreed. Now come on. Got a camp about 5 miles north. We'll rest up, plan this properly. Just like old times. They rode on as the sun set, and Colt tried not to think about Rosalind's face as he'd left, tried not to hear her voice telling him not to come back, tried not to feel the weight of another choice, another bad choice, in a lifetime of them, settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The camp was exactly what he'd expected, a small clearing near a creek, well hidden from the main road with evidence of recent use. Jake's operation, whatever it was, clearly involved more than just these 3 men. There were supplies here, provisions, extra ammunition. This wasn't a temporary setup. This was a base. Make yourself comfortable, Jake said, swinging down from his horse. Got some beans and bacon we can heat up. Tom, get a fire going. The young one, Tom, hurried to comply, his nervousness even more pronounced now that they'd stopped moving. The older man just watched Colt with those flat, dead eyes, and Colt made a mental note to keep track of him at all times. So, Jake settled down on a log near where Tom was building the fire. Tell me about the school teacher. She pretty as she looked from a distance? Don't. Colt's voice was flat, hard. Don't talk about her. Touchy. Must be serious then. Jake pulled out a flask, took a long drink. You really planning to marry her? Settle down, play house, pretend like you're some kind of respectable citizen? That was the plan. Was. Past tense. Interesting. Jake offered the flask, and when Colt refused, he shrugged and took another drink himself. You know what your problem is, Merrick? You think you can outrun what you are. Think if you ride far enough, change your name enough times, maybe you'll become someone different, but you can't. We are what we are, and pretending otherwise just makes it hurt more when reality catches up. That your philosophy? Colt asked. Just accept that you're a piece of shit and stop trying to be better? It's honest. Jake's eyes glittered in the growing firelight. And honestly, I sleep pretty well at night. Better than you do, I'd wager. All that guilt weighing you down, all those what-ifs and might-have-beens, must be exhausting. It was exhausting. Colt wanted to argue, to defend himself, but what was the point? Jake was right about one thing. He was tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of trying to be something he wasn't sure he could ever actually become. They ate in silence as the stars came out, and Colt found himself thinking about Rosalind, wondering what she was doing right now, whether she was crying or angry or relieved that he'd left, whether she'd already started telling herself it was for the best, that she'd had a lucky escape from a man who was exactly as dangerous as everyone had warned her. Get some sleep, Jake said eventually. Long ride tomorrow. But Colt didn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll staring up at the stars, listening to the others snore, and thought about choices and consequences and the difference between the two. He'd chosen to leave Birch Hollow, had told himself it was to protect Rosalind, to keep her safe from men like Jake. But lying there in the darkness, he could admit the truth. He'd left because it was easier than staying, easier than fighting for something he didn't believe he deserved, easier than risking his heart and having it broken when she inevitably realized what he really was. Coward. Rosalind had called him a coward, and she'd been right. The next 2 days passed in a blur of planning and preparation. Jake laid out the payroll route, explained the timing, detailed how they'd hit the wagon and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. It was professional, well thought out, the work of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know all the angles. And Colt found himself slipping back into old patterns, old instincts, like putting on a coat he'd thought he'd outgrown. You remember how to do this? Jake asked the night before the job, watching Colt check his gun with practiced efficiency. It's not something you forget. No, I suppose not. Jake was quiet for a moment. You ever think about the old days? The gang? We had some good times. We had some terrible times, Colt corrected. We hurt people, stole from folks who couldn't afford it. I'm not proud of what we did. But you were good at it. Jake leaned forward. That's what you can't forgive yourself for, isn't it? Not that you did bad things, but that you were good at them. That part of you enjoyed it. Colt wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat, because there was a kernel of truth there, small and sharp and painful. He had been good at it, had felt alive in those moments when everything came down to split-second decisions and steady hands, had felt like he mattered, like he was part of something bigger than himself, even if that something was wrong. "I'm not that person anymore," he said finally. "We'll see," Jake replied. "Tomorrow, we'll see who you really are." They rode out before dawn, 4 men moving through the gray pre-morning light like ghosts. The canyon was about 15 miles southeast, a narrow passage where the payroll wagon would have to slow down, where there was cover and concealment and a dozen ways to disappear after the job was done. It was perfect, tactically speaking, which meant someone was going to get hurt. "Remember," Jake said as they took their positions in the rocks above the canyon floor. "Quick and clean, we show the guns, they surrender the money, everyone goes home alive, no heroes." But Colt had been in enough of these situations to know it never went that clean. Someone always tried to be a hero. Someone always made the wrong move at the wrong time. And then people died, and you carried that weight for the rest of your life, however long that turned out to be. They waited. The sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Tom was fidgeting with his rifle, nervous energy rolling off him in waves. The older man, Jake had called him Samuel, was perfectly still, patient as a snake. And Jake himself seemed relaxed, almost cheerful, like this was just another day at work. Colt checked his gun for the 3rd time, more out of habit than necessity. He was thinking about Rosalind again, about the last conversation they'd had, about her standing on that porch telling him not to come back. He wondered if she meant it, wondered if he'd have the courage to find out, assuming he survived this. "Here they come," Jake's voice was low, focused. "Get ready." The wagon appeared around the bend. Military issue, 2 horses pulling it, 3 guards visible. 1 driving, 2 flanking on horseback. Standard escort for a payroll run. But as they got closer, Colt saw something that made his stomach drop. There was a 4th person on the wagon, smaller, slighter, a woman. "Jake," he hissed, "there's a civilian." "I see her." Jake's voice was unconcerned. "Probably a laundress hitching a ride. Doesn't change anything." "Like hell it doesn't. We can and we will." Jake stood, rifle raised. "Now!" Everything happened at once. Jake fired a warning shot, the crack echoing off the canyon walls. The guards shouted, reaching for their weapons. Tom stood up too fast, lost his footing, his rifle discharging accidentally. And the woman on the wagon screamed, a high, terrified sound that cut through the chaos like a knife. Colt was moving before he thought about it, scrambling down from his position, shouting for everyone to stop, to hold fire. But it was too late. One of the guards had his pistol out and was shooting at Jake's position. Samuel returned fire, his bullet taking the guard in the shoulder. The horses reared, spooked by the gunfire. The wagon driver was trying to control them and reach for his weapon at the same time. And the woman was frozen, her hands over her ears, her mouth open in a soundless scream. "Stand down!" Colt's voice cut through the noise. "Everyone stand down!" For a miracle, they listened. The shooting stopped. The guards, seeing themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered, raised their hands. The driver managed to calm the horses. And slowly, carefully, the situation de-escalated from chaos into tense standoff. "Good." Jake climbed down from his position, still holding his rifle. "Now, this is how it's going to work. You're going to hand over that payroll nice and easy, and we're all going to walk away from this. Nobody else needs to get hurt." The driver was an older man, grizzled and clearly military, with the kind of face that had seen too much combat to be impressed by 4 outlaws. "You know what you're doing, son? That's army money. They'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Then it's a good thing the earth is big," Jake gestured with his rifle. "The money. Now." But Colt wasn't listening. He was watching the woman, really watching her for the first time, and feeling ice run through his veins. She was young, maybe 22, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and a face he recognized from a photograph he'd seen on Rosalind's mantle. Sarah, her niece, who was supposed to be at school back east, who'd written letters about her studies and her plans for the future. Sarah Hayes, riding on a military payroll wagon in the middle of Montana Territory, about to be robbed by the man her aunt had nearly married. "Colt?" Sarah's voice was small, confused. "Colt Merrick?" And just like that, everything Colt had been trying to build, every chance he had of redemption, crumbled to dust. Because there was no way to explain this, no way to make it right. He'd promised to be better, promised to leave his old life behind, and here he was robbing a military payroll with his former gang while Rosalind's niece watched in horror. "You know her?" Jake's voice was sharp, suspicious. "No." The lie came automatically, but Sarah's face gave him away. The recognition, the betrayal, the dawning understanding that the man her aunt had trusted was exactly what everyone had warned her about. "He does." The driver saw it too. "They know each other." Jake's expression went cold and calculating. "That's unfortunate. Samuel, bring her down here." "No." Colt moved without thinking, putting himself between Samuel and the wagon. "Leave her alone. She's got nothing to do with this." "She's a witness who can identify us," Jake pointed out reasonably. "That makes her everything to do with this." "I said leave her alone." Colt's hand was on his gun now, and the dynamic of the situation shifted again. No longer 4 outlaws against 3 guards. Now it was Colt against everyone. Jake studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're going soft on me, Merrick, just like I thought." "Maybe I am, but I'm not letting you hurt that girl." "I'm not planning to hurt her, just need to make sure she can't identify us." Jake's smile was cold. "Unless you got a better idea?" Colt did have an idea, though he knew even thinking it meant crossing a line he couldn't uncross. "Let them go. All of them. The payroll, the guards, the girl. Let them ride out of here." "And why would I do that?" "Because I'll stay. I'll face whatever charges come. Turn myself in, testify that you weren't here, that I did this alone." Colt could see the pieces falling into place, the way this could work, the way he could save them and damn himself in the process. "You get away clean, and I get to do one good thing before this is all over." Jake laughed. "You'd throw yourself away for a girl you don't even know? For people who mean nothing to you?" "She's not nothing." Colt kept his eyes on Jake, his hand steady on his gun. "She's someone's family, someone I care about. That makes her worth protecting." The silence stretched out, broken only by the nervous whickering of horses and the sound of Sarah trying not to cry. Colt could feel his heart hammering, could taste copper in his mouth from biting his cheek. This was it. The moment where everything either went to hell or he managed to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. "You know what?" Jake said finally. "I think I'm going to take you up on that offer. Not because I believe in your noble sacrifice, but because watching you destroy yourself is going to be more entertaining than any money we'd get from this payroll." He looked at the driver. "You and your men get out of here. Take the girl. Ride straight back to Fort Benson and tell them Colt Merrick robbed you at gunpoint. Tell them he acted alone, that there was no one else here." "But," the driver started. "Do it." Jake's voice cracked like a whip. "Before I change my mind and shoot all of you just to shut you up." They didn't need to be told twice. The guards mounted up, the driver snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Sarah was crying openly now, looking back at Colt with an expression of confusion and horror, and something that might have been understanding. "Tell her," Colt called out as they pulled away. "Tell Rosalind I'm sorry. Tell her she was right about everything." Sarah nodded, just once, and then they were gone. Around the bend and out of sight, hoofbeats fading into the distance. And Colt was left standing in the canyon with 3 men who'd just watched him throw away his freedom for nothing. "Well," Jake said, holstering his rifle. "That was touching. Stupid as hell, but touching." "What now?" Colt asked. "Now? Now you run." Jake's expression was unreadable. "Because I'm letting you go, Merrick. No job, no payroll, no clearing your name. Just you and whatever conscience you've developed, getting to live with the choices you've made." "I don't understand." "I know you don't. That's what makes this fun." Jake mounted his horse. "See, I realized something watching you throw yourself on that grenade. You're already punishing yourself worse than I ever could. Every day you wake up and try to be better. Every time you fail, every time you disappoint someone who believed in you, that's torture enough. I don't need to add to it." "So you're just leaving?" "I'm just leaving." Jake turned his horse. "But Merrick, next time I see you, we won't be having this conversation. Next time I'll kill you. That's a promise." They rode off, Jake and Tom and Samuel, leaving Colt standing alone in the canyon with nothing but his horse and the knowledge of what he'd just done. He'd saved Sarah and the guards, kept them safe from whatever Jake had been planning, but in doing so, he'd confirmed every suspicion, validated every fear. Rosalind would hear about this, would know he'd been part of an attempted robbery, that everything she'd feared about him was true. He couldn't go back to Birch Hollow. Not now. Not with a new bounty almost certainly coming, with his name about to be spread across the territory as the man who'd robbed a military payroll. He was back where he'd started, alone, wanted, with nowhere to go and nothing to show for any of it. Colt climbed onto his horse and rode north, away from the canyon, away from Birch Hollow, away from everything. He rode until the sun was setting and his horse was exhausted and his mind was numb from thinking. And then he made camp in a hollow by a stream and sat staring at the fire, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. 3 days later, he was still riding when the sound of hoofbeats brought him up short. Too many horses, moving too fast. His first thought was Jake, come back to make good on his threat. But when the riders appeared, they were wearing uniforms, Army, from Fort Benson. And leading them, riding with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, was Rosalind Hayes. She pulled up about 20 feet away, and the soldiers fanned out behind her, rifles ready but not aimed. Yet. Colt's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped. What was the point? He was caught. It was over. Miss Hayes? His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. What are you doing here? Looking for you, apparently. She dismounted, moving toward him with that same fearless determination he remembered from Birch Hollow. Though I'm told I shouldn't get too close, as you're a dangerous criminal who robbed a military payroll. That's what they're saying? Among other things. She stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough that the soldiers wouldn't panic. But here's the interesting part. Sarah told me what really happened in that canyon, told me how you stopped the robbery, how you let everyone go, how you gave yourself up to save them. Colt shook his head. I was part of it, part of the plan to rob that wagon. Were you? Because Sarah said you looked horrified when you recognized her, said you put yourself between her and the other men, said you sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Rosalind's eyes were fierce. That doesn't sound like a criminal to me. That sounds like a hero. I'm not a hero, Rosalind. You're a man who's been running from his past for so long, he doesn't know how to stop. She took another step closer. You're a man who thinks he doesn't deserve forgiveness, so he keeps putting himself in situations where he'll never get it. You're a man who saved my niece's life, and I'll be damned if I let you throw yourself away because you think that's what you deserve. The soldiers were murmuring behind her, but Rosalind ignored them. She closed the distance between them, close enough now that Colt could see the tears in her eyes, the exhaustion on her face, the absolute determination in every line of her body. Come back, she said simply. Come back to Birch Hollow and face this properly. Let us help you. They'll arrest me. There'll be a trial. Then we'll get you a lawyer. We'll tell the truth about what happened. About Jake Hollis and his lies, about the canyon, about all of it. She reached out and took his hand. But we'll do it together. No more running. No more throwing yourself away because you think it's noble. Just you and me fighting for the life we both want. Colt looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. I don't deserve you. Probably not, she agreed. But you're stuck with me anyway. So what do you say, Colt Merrick? Ready to stop running and start living? He thought about all the reasons to say no, all the ways this could still go wrong, all the people who'd be disappointed when he inevitably failed. And then he thought about what Jake had said, that he was already punishing himself worse than anyone else could, that every day trying to be better was its own kind of torture. Maybe it was time to stop torturing himself. Maybe it was time to accept that he wasn't perfect, that he'd never be perfect, but that he could still be worth fighting for. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah, I'm ready. Rosalind smiled, a real smile, bright and beautiful despite the tears streaming down her face. Good, because I already told the sheriff we'd be back by Friday, and I have a reputation for being punctual. She squeezed his hand once, then turned to the soldiers. Gentlemen, Mr. Merrick is surrendering voluntarily to face questioning about the incident at the canyon. I trust you'll treat him with the respect due to a man who saved lives rather than taking them." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. We'll take good care of him." And so Colt Merrick, for the second time in his life, let himself be taken into custody. But this time he wasn't running. This time he was riding towards something instead of away from it. And this time he had someone riding beside him who believed he was worth saving. It was a start. The ride back to Birch Hollow took 2 days, and every mile felt like a judgment. Colt rode with his hands bound. Not tightly, the sergeant had been decent about that. Flanked by 4 soldiers who kept their rifles ready, but their expressions neutral. Rosalind rode beside him the whole way, her presence a constant reminder of everything he stood to lose and everything he was fighting for. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? The facts were simple and damning. He'd ridden out with known criminals, had been part of a plan to rob a military payroll, had only stopped it because he'd recognized Sarah. The law didn't care about intentions or last-minute changes of heart. The law cared about actions, and his actions made him guilty. But as they crested the final ridge and Birch Hollow came into view, small and tidy and impossibly fragile in the afternoon light, Rosalind finally spoke. "They're going to be angry," she said quietly. "The town. They'll see this as proof they were right about you all along." "They were right." "No." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were fierce. "They were afraid. There's a difference. Fear makes people see threats everywhere, makes them forget that redemption is possible. But I'm not afraid of you, Colt. And I'm not going to let them crucify you for trying to protect my family." "Rosalind," he kept his voice low, aware of the soldiers listening. "You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this doesn't end well, that I end up in prison or worse. You can't tie your life to mine if—" "I'm not tying my life to anything," she interrupted. "I'm choosing it, freely, with full knowledge of the risks." She reached over and touched his bound hands, just for a moment. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop trying to make my choices for me." Despite everything, Colt almost smiled. Even facing disgrace and possible imprisonment, Rosalind Hayes was still the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. It was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. They rode into town just as the church bell was tolling 4. Word of their arrival must have spread fast, because by the time they reached the sheriff's office, half of Birch Hollow had gathered in the street. The expressions ranged from curiosity to hostility, to something that might have been satisfaction. There it was, proof that the stranger had been dangerous all along. Sheriff Hendricks was waiting on the porch, and to Colt's surprise, his expression wasn't angry, just tired, resigned, like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had been dreading it anyway. "Sergeant Morrison," he greeted the lead soldier. "I got your telegram. Says here Mr. Merrick is wanted for questioning regarding the attempted robbery at Dead Horse Canyon." "That's correct, Sheriff." The sergeant dismounted, helping Colt down after. "Though I should mention that the witnesses paint a more complicated picture than a simple robbery." "I'm sure they do." Hendricks opened the door to his office. "Bring him inside, Miss Hayes. You should probably—" "I'm coming in," Rosalind said in a tone that brooked no argument. "Unless you plan to arrest me too." "No, ma'am. Just thought you might want to avoid the spectacle." "I've never been one to avoid spectacles, Thomas. You know that." She followed them inside, and Colt heard the murmur of the crowd behind them, speculation and judgment, and the particular kind of excitement that came from watching someone else's life fall apart. The sheriff's office was small and plain, with a desk covered in papers, 2 cells in the back, and a gun rack on the wall. Hendricks gestured for Colt to sit, then turned to the sergeant. "You want to tell me what happened out there?" The sergeant did, a full account of the incident at the canyon, including Sarah's testimony and the statements from the guards. He was fair about it, Colt had to admit. Didn't embellish or editorialize, just laid out the facts as they'd been reported. When he finished, Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, studying Colt like he was a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. "So let me make sure I understand," the sheriff said finally. "You rode out with Jake Hollis and his men, planning to rob a military payroll. But when you saw Miss Sarah Hayes on that wagon, you stopped the robbery, let everyone go, and offered to turn yourself in." "That's about the size of it," Colt confirmed. "And why exactly were you riding with Hollis in the first place? Thought you were done with that life." This was the part Colt had been dreading. He could lie, could make up some story about being coerced or threatened. But he'd promised Rosalind no more lies, and he meant to keep that promise even if it damned him. Hollis found me in town, threatened to destroy any chance I had of staying here unless I did one last job for him. He had information about my past, things he could use to make my life hell. So I went with him. Colt met the sheriff's eyes. I'm not proud of it. I'm not making excuses. But that's the truth. And you believed him? That he'd keep his word and leave you alone after? I believed I didn't have a choice. It was as honest as Colt could be. I was wrong. I made a bad decision based on fear and desperation, and people could have been killed because of it. That's on me. Hendricks turned to Rosalind. And you want to defend this man? After everything? I want justice for this man, Rosalind corrected. There's a difference. Yes, he made a mistake. Yes, he should have come to you instead of riding out with Hollis. But when it mattered, when lives were actually at stake, he did the right thing. That should count for something. It does count for something, ma'am. But I'm not sure it counts for enough. The sheriff sighed. The Army wants someone to prosecute. They've got public opinion breathing down their necks, senators asking questions about security. They need to make an example. Then let them make an example of Jake Hollis and his actual gang, Rosalind shot back. Colt can help with that. He knows where they camp, how they operate. He can give you everything you need to bring them in. In exchange for what? Immunity? A pardon? Hendricks shook his head. That's not my call to make. That'd be up to the territorial judge, and he's not exactly known for his mercy. Then we'll argue for mercy, Rosalind said firmly. We'll bring in Sarah to testify, get statements from the guards he saved. We'll show the judge that Colt Merrick is not the same man he was 7 years ago, that he's someone worth saving. The sergeant cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Sheriff, my men and I would be willing to testify on Mr. Merrick's behalf. What he did in that canyon, putting himself between armed men and civilians, that took courage. The kind of courage you don't see in career criminals. Colt stared at the sergeant, surprised. They'd barely spoken on the ride back, and he'd assumed the soldiers saw him as just another outlaw. But the man's expression was sincere, almost respectful. Appreciate that, Sergeant. Hendricks rubbed his face, looking every one of his 40-some years. All right, here's what's going to happen. I'm holding Mr. Merrick here until the judge arrives next week. Trial will be public, and I expect half the territory will show up to watch. In the meantime, Miss Hayes, if you want to help him, I'd suggest finding a good lawyer and getting all your witnesses lined up. He's going to need them. I'll do that. Rosalind stood, then turned to Colt. I'll be back tomorrow, with food and books and whatever else you need. Rosalind. He wanted to say so much, apologies and explanations and promises he had no right to make. But with the sheriff and the soldiers watching, all he could manage was, thank you. She smiled, sad and determined. Don't thank me yet. We have a long fight ahead of us. After she left, Hendricks unlocked one of the cells and gestured for Colt to enter. It was sparse, a cot, a chamber pot, a small window set high in the wall. Colt had been in worse, but something about seeing that door close and hearing the lock click felt final in a way that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Sheriff, he said as Hendricks turned to leave, why are you helping? Or letting Rosalind help? You never wanted me here in the first place. Hendricks paused, considering. You're right. I didn't trust you when you rode in. Didn't like the idea of Rosalind hitching herself to a man with your history. He turned back. But I also didn't like how Garrett and some of the others treated you, like you'd already been tried and found guilty before you'd done anything wrong here. That's not justice. That's just fear and prejudice dressed up as law. So you believe I can change? That people can be redeemed? I believe it's possible. Hendricks met his eyes. I also believe it's rare as hell and requires more than just good intentions. But yeah, I've seen enough of life to know that people aren't always what they seem. You get a chance to prove you're better than your past, Merrick. Don't waste it. The days that followed were strange, suspended time where everything moved both too fast and too slow. Rosalind came every day, bringing food and newspapers and books she thought he'd like. They talked through the bars of his cell about everything and nothing, her students, his childhood, the trial strategy her lawyer was developing. She never mentioned the wedding they'd been planning, the life they'd been building. It hung between them like smoke, visible but intangible, a future that might never materialize. On the third day, Sarah came. Colt heard her voice in the outer office, young and nervous, asking if she could see the prisoner. When Hendricks brought her back, she stood in front of his cell looking both terrified and determined. "Miss Hayes," Colt said, standing out of respect, "you didn't need to come." "Yes, I did." She twisted her hands together, a nervous gesture that reminded him painfully of Rosalind. "I needed to thank you for what you did in the canyon. The guards told me those men would have hurt us if you hadn't stopped them. I was part of the reason you were in danger in the first place." "Were you?" Sarah tilted her head, studying him. "Because Aunt Rosalind told me about Jake Hollis, about his threats and his lies, about how he manipulated you into riding with him." She paused. "I'm not saying you didn't make mistakes, but it seems to me that you were trying to protect people, Aunt Rosalind, me, this whole town, in the only way you knew how. I should have found a better way. Maybe. But you didn't. And when it mattered, you still did the right thing." Sarah stepped closer to the bars. "I'm going to testify at your trial. I'm going to tell them exactly what happened, how you saved us, how you could have run but didn't, how you chose to face justice instead of disappearing. And I'm going to tell them that my aunt loves you, and that she's the smartest, most perceptive person I know. If she believes you're worth saving, then so do I." Colt felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, exactly, but opening, letting in light he didn't know he'd been shutting out. "You don't owe me this." "No," Sarah agreed, "but Aunt Rosalind does, and you owe her the chance to fight for you. So please, Mr. Merrick, don't give up. Don't decide you're not worth saving before you give the rest of us a chance to prove otherwise." She left, and Colt sat on his cot for a long time, staring at nothing. All his life he'd been running, from his past, from his mistakes, from anyone who tried to get close enough to see who he really was. And where had it gotten him? Alone in a cell, facing prison or hanging, with nothing to show for 32 years except regrets and a trail of abandoned chances. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to stop running, to stand still and face whatever came, to let people fight for him instead of always fighting alone. It was terrifying in a way that gunfights and robberies had never been, but it was also something else, something that felt almost like hope. The town, predictably, was divided. Colt learned this from Rosalind's daily visits, from snippets of conversation he overheard when Hendricks had visitors in the outer office. There were those like Martin Garrett who saw the attempted robbery as proof they'd been right all along. Colt Merrick was dangerous, had always been dangerous, and should be locked away before he brought more trouble to Birch Hollow. But there were others, surprisingly, who were willing to consider the possibility of redemption. Mrs. Chen from the Mercantile, who remembered how politely Colt had always treated her. Pastor Williams, who'd apparently had a change of heart after hearing Sarah's testimony. Even a few of the parents whose children Colt had helped at the school. "It's not enough," Rosalind told him on the 5th day, her voice tight with frustration. "Even with the witnesses, even with Sarah and the soldiers, the lawyer says it's going to be close. The judge, his name is Harlan Pierce, by the way, has a reputation for being tough on repeat offenders." "I am a repeat offender," Colt pointed out gently. "Multiple robberies, assault, even if the charges were dropped. Charges that were dropped because they were based on lies and false testimony." Rosalind gripped the bars of his cell, her knuckles white. "Colt, I've been doing research. I've written to officials in Kansas City, in Wyoming, in every place Jake Hollis might have implicated you in crimes you didn't commit. I'm building a case that your entire criminal history is questionable at best. That'll take months, maybe years." "Then will take months or years." She met his eyes, fierce and uncompromising. "I told you I'm not giving up on you. I meant it. Even if I'm convicted, even if I end up in territorial prison for the next 10 years, even then," she said it without hesitation, "though I'm hoping it doesn't come to that." "Rosalind." He reached through the bars, touching her hand. "You deserve better than waiting for a convict. You deserve someone who can give you the life you want right now." "What I want is you." She turned her hand, lacing her fingers with his. "I want your laugh that sounds surprised every time, like you're not used to being happy. I want your careful way of fixing things, like every broken fence is a puzzle worth solving. I want the way you read my books and remember what I said 3 conversations ago. I want all of it, Colt. The good and the bad and the complicated. That's what loving someone means. It was the first time she'd said it directly. Loving someone. Loving him. And Colt felt the weight of it settle over him like a blanket. Warm and heavy and terrifying. He wanted to say it back. Wanted to tell her that somewhere between fixing her fence and reading her poetry and watching her teach her students, he'd fallen so completely in love with her that the thought of losing her was worse than any prison sentence. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with fear and unworthiness and the bone-deep certainty that he'd already ruined everything. I don't know how to do this, he said instead. How to let someone love me. Then we'll figure it out together. She squeezed his hand. That's the deal, remember? We mess it up together. The trial was set for Monday morning, exactly 8 days after Colt had ridden back into Birch Hollow in chains. Judge Pierce arrived on Sunday afternoon, a severe man with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of human depravity, and found it all equally disappointing. He set up court in the town hall, the largest building in Birch Hollow, and by Monday morning every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Colt was brought in through a side door, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, cleaned as best he could manage with the basin and soap Rosalind had provided. He looked out at the crowd and saw familiar faces. Rosalind in the front row, Sarah beside her, Sheriff Hendricks standing near the back, Sergeant Morrison and 2 of his soldiers in their dress uniforms, Mrs. Chen and Pastor Williams, and even Martin Garrett, whose expression was unreadable. The prosecutor was a thin man named Davidson, sent from the territorial capital specifically for this case. He laid out his case efficiently. Colt Merrick, known criminal with a history of robbery and violence, had conspired with Jake Hollis to rob a military payroll. That he'd stopped the robbery at the last moment didn't change the fact that he'd been part of the initial plan, had ridden out with armed men with the intent to commit a federal crime. The law was clear. Conspiracy to commit robbery was itself a crime, punishable by imprisonment. Rosalind's lawyer, a young man named Thompson, who'd traveled from Helena specifically for this case, argued differently. Yes, Colt had made an error in judgment. Yes, he'd ridden out with Hollis under duress and misguided hope. But when the actual moment of choice came, when lives were at stake, he'd acted heroically. He'd put himself between armed criminals and innocent civilians. He'd given up his freedom to ensure others' safety. That wasn't the action of a career criminal. That was the action of a man trying desperately to be better than his past. The witnesses came one by one. Sarah, composed and clear, describing exactly what had happened in the canyon. The soldiers, professional and respectful, confirming that Colt had prevented violence and potentially saved lives. Even the wagon driver testified, grudging but honest, that he'd expected to die that day until Colt Merrick had stopped it. Then Rosalind took the stand, and the whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Miss Hayes, but she says, Davidson began, his tone respectful but probing. You've known the defendant for approximately 3 weeks, is that correct? Yes. And in that time you became engaged to marry him? We discussed marriage, yes. Despite knowing about his criminal history, his past as an outlaw, I knew he had made mistakes in his past, Rosalind said carefully. I also knew he was trying to change, trying to build a different life. But he didn't build a different life, did he? Davidson pressed. The moment his old associates came calling, he went right back to his criminal ways. Doesn't that suggest that people like Mr. Merrick don't really change, that they just hide their true nature until circumstances reveal it? No? Rosalind's voice was strong, clear. It suggests that change is hard and complicated and doesn't happen in a straight line. It suggests that sometimes people make mistakes even when they're trying to do the right thing, and it suggests that we shouldn't judge someone's entire character based on their worst moment. Even when that worst moment involves conspiring to rob the United States Army? Especially then. Rosalind leaned forward slightly. Mr. Davidson, my late husband was a minister. He believed deeply in redemption, in the idea that no one is beyond saving. I didn't always share his faith. I'm a practical woman, and I've seen too much of the world to believe in easy grace. But I've also learned that people are complicated, that they contain multitudes, that someone can have done terrible things and still be capable of tremendous good. She turned to look directly at Colt, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Colt Merrick saved my niece's life. He saved 4 people who would have been hurt or killed if he hadn't intervened. He did that knowing it would cost him everything: his freedom, his future, any chance he had at the quiet life he wanted. And he did it anyway, because when the moment came, he chose courage over cowardice. He chose sacrifice over self-preservation. That's not the action of an irredeemable criminal. That's the action of a good man who's still learning how to be good. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Davidson seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Pierce made a note on the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Miss Hayes," the judge said finally. "You may step down." The final witness was Colt himself. Thompson had debated whether to put him on the stand. It was risky, giving the prosecutor a chance to tear into him. But Colt had insisted. If he was going to be judged, he wanted it to be based on the truth, not speculation. Davidson was merciless. He went through Colt's entire history, every crime he'd been accused of, every charge, whether dropped or not. He painted a picture of a man who'd spent 15 years taking what wasn't his, hurting people who got in his way, living outside the law and society. And then he asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Mr. Merrick, you claim you've changed, that you're trying to be a better man. But when Jake Hollis came to town, when he threatened you, you didn't go to the sheriff. You didn't ask for help. You went right back to your old life. Why should we believe you've changed at all?" Colt had thought about this question for 8 days, had turned it over in his mind 1,000 times, and he still didn't have a good answer, just the truth. "Because I was scared," he said quietly. "Because for 15 years, the only person I could rely on was myself. The only way I knew to solve problems was to handle them alone, even if that meant making bad choices. I didn't go to the sheriff because I didn't believe anyone would help me. Didn't believe I deserved help. And now? Now I know I was wrong." Colt looked out at the courtroom, at Rosalind and Sarah and all the people who'd shown up to testify on his behalf. "I was wrong about a lot of things, about being alone being safer, about not deserving help or love or a second chance, about running being the only option." He paused. "I'm not claiming to be perfect. I'm not even claiming to be good. But I am trying. And I think that should count for something." Davidson studied him for a long moment. "And if you're convicted, Mr. Merrick? If this court decides that trying isn't enough, what then?" "Then I accept the consequences of my actions." Colt met the prosecutor's eyes steadily. "I'll serve whatever sentence is given, and I'll keep trying to be better. Because the alternative, giving up, going back to what I was, that's not an option anymore. Not with people believing in me the way they do." When Thompson asked if he had anything else to say, Colt turned to Judge Pierce directly. "Your Honor, I know my history doesn't speak well for me. I know I've done things I can never undo, hurt people I can never make whole. But I also know that if you give me a chance, if you let me stay in Birch Hollow and build the life I was trying to build, I'll spend every day proving that people can change. That redemption is possible. Not just for me, but for anyone willing to do the hard work of becoming better than they were." The judge listened without expression, then called for a recess. The jury, 12 men from surrounding towns brought in specifically because they had no connection to Birch Hollow, filed out to deliberate, and Colt was taken back to his cell to wait. 3 hours later, they returned with a verdict. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the jury filed back in. Colt watched their faces, trying to read something, anything, in their expressions, but they were carefully neutral. 12 men who held his future in their hands, who'd spent 3 hours deciding whether he was worth saving or just another criminal who deserved whatever punishment the law could deliver. Judge Pierce's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a weathered rancher from a town 30 miles east, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit robbery of United States military property, how do you find the defendant?" The pause lasted only a heartbeat, but to Colt it felt like a lifetime. He could feel Rosalind's eyes on him, could sense the entire town holding its breath, waiting. "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hit like a physical blow. Colt heard Rosalind's sharp intake of breath, heard the murmur ripple through the crowd. He kept his face carefully blank, but inside something was crumbling. The fragile hope he'd been building, the possibility of a future that didn't involve bars and chains and endless gray years. However, the foreman wasn't finished. The jury wishes to recommend mercy. We believe the defendant's actions in preventing harm to innocent civilians should be taken into consideration during sentencing. Judge Pierce made a note, his expression still unreadable. The court acknowledges the jury's recommendation. Mr. Merrick, please stand. Colt stood, his legs steadier than he'd expected. He'd been here before, waiting for judgment, waiting for consequences to catch up with choices he'd made in desperation or anger or fear, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't alone. Mr. Merrick, Judge Pierce began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent deciding the fates of men who'd broken laws and broken lives. I've presided over hundreds of cases in my 20 years on the bench. I've seen every kind of criminal you can imagine. Men who killed for pleasure, who stole because they enjoyed it, who hurt others without a moment's remorse. I've also seen men who made mistakes, who found themselves in circumstances that pushed them toward choices they'd never have made otherwise. He paused, looking down at his papers, then back at Colt. The question before me is, which kind of man are you? Are you the outlaw who rode with Jake Hollis, who planned to rob a military payroll? Or are you the man who stopped that robbery, who put innocent lives above your own freedom? The law says both things can't be true, that you're either guilty or innocent. But life, as I've learned, is rarely that simple. Colt's throat was tight, but he forced himself to speak. Your Honor, I don't expect you to excuse what I did. I made a choice to ride with Hollis, and that choice was wrong. But I'm asking you to see that I'm trying to be more than that one wrong choice, that I'm trying every day to be better than I was. I can see that, Mr. Merrick. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I can see it in the testimony of Miss Hayes and her niece. I can see it in the soldiers who spoke on your behalf, in the people of this town who came forward despite their initial suspicions. And I can see it in the fact that you came back to face trial rather than running, as would have been much easier. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. But here's what troubles me. This isn't your first brush with the law. You have a history, a long history, of making wrong choices, of falling back into old patterns when circumstances get difficult. How can I, or this court, or the people of Birch Hollow trust that you won't do it again? That the next time Jake Hollis or someone like him comes calling, you won't make the same mistake? It was the question Colt had been asking himself for 8 days, the question that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his cell. How could anyone trust him when he barely trusted himself? You can't, Your Honor. The honesty felt like stripping away armor, leaving himself exposed. I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't guarantee that I'll always make the right choice under pressure. All I can promise is that I'll keep trying, that I'll ask for help instead of handling things alone, that I'll trust the people who believe in me instead of assuming I have to face everything by myself. Judge Pierce was quiet for a long moment, studying Colt like he was trying to see past the surface to whatever lay beneath. Finally, he spoke. The jury has found you guilty of conspiracy to commit robbery. The standard sentence for such a crime is 5 to 10 years in territorial prison. He paused, and Colt felt his heart sink. 10 years. A decade of his life gone. By the time he got out, he'd be past 40, and Rosalind would have moved on, built a life without him. It was what he deserved, but that didn't make it hurt any less. However, the judge continued, and something in his tone made Colt look up sharply. I am inclined to accept the jury's recommendation for mercy, given the unusual circumstances of this case. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 5 years in territorial prison with the sentence suspended. The courtroom erupted. Colt stood frozen, not sure he'd heard correctly. Suspended? That meant, silence! Judge Pierce's gavel cracked like a gunshot. I'm not finished. Mr. Merrick, you will remain in Birch Hollow under the supervision of Sheriff Hendricks for a period of 5 years. During that time, you will report to the sheriff weekly, you will maintain steady employment, and you will not leave the immediate area without explicit permission from this court. You will also provide information and testimony regarding Jake Hollis and his criminal enterprise, cooperating fully with federal marshals in their efforts to apprehend him. Pierce leaned forward, his eyes hard. This is not a pardon, Mr. Merrick. This is an opportunity, possibly the last one you'll ever get. If you violate the terms of your probation in any way, you will serve the full 5 years in prison. If you commit any crime, however minor, you will serve the full 5 years. If Sheriff Hendricks reports that you are not living up to the standards of behavior expected of you, you will serve the full 5 years. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Colt's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. I understand. Good. Because I'm taking a considerable risk here, Mr. Merrick. I'm trusting that the people who spoke on your behalf are right about you, that you are capable of redemption. Don't make me regret that trust. He raised his gavel. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and suddenly Colt was surrounded by people. Rosalind reached him first, throwing her arms around him with such force that he stumbled backward. She was crying and laughing at the same time, her face pressed against his chest. I told you, she said, her voice muffled. I told you we'd fight this together. Rosalind. He held her tight, not caring that half the town was watching, not caring about anything except the fact that she was real and solid, and he wasn't going to lose her after all. I'm sorry for everything, for leaving, for not trusting you, for— Shut up, she said, pulling back to look at him. Her eyes were red but fierce. You can apologize later. Right now, I just want to take you home. Home. The words settled into Colt's chest, warm and unfamiliar and precious. He had a home. He had people who believed in him. He had a chance, a real chance, to be more than his past. Sheriff Hendricks materialized beside them, and his expression was almost kind. Congratulations, Merrick. Looks like you get to stay after all. Thank you, Sheriff. For everything. Don't thank me yet. You heard the judge. You're under my supervision for the next 5 years. That means you step 1 inch out of line, I hear about it. But there was no real threat in his voice, just a warning. Now get out of here. I'm sure you two have things to discuss. They walked out of the courthouse into brilliant afternoon sunlight, and Colt had to stop for a moment, just breathing in the air as a free man. Well, mostly free. He'd take probation over prison any day. The crowd had followed them outside, and the reactions were mixed. Some people were clearly unhappy with the verdict. Martin Garrett stormed off without a word, and several others muttered about soft judges and dangerous criminals. But others came forward to shake Colt's hand, to welcome him back to town, to tell him they were glad he was staying. Mrs. Chen from the Mercantile pressed a small package into his hands. For you and Miss Rosalind. Wedding present, for whenever you decide to have the ceremony. Mrs. Chen, I can't. You can and you will. She patted his arm. You're a good man, Mr. Merrick. Don't let anyone tell you different. Pastor Williams approached next, looking somewhat embarrassed. Mr. Merrick, I owe you an apology. I was too quick to judge, too ready to believe the worst. If you and Miss Hayes would still like me to perform your wedding ceremony, I'd be honored. Thank you, Pastor. Colt glanced at Rosalind. Though I'm not sure if— 3 weeks, Rosalind said firmly. Same as we originally planned. That gives me enough time to finish the school term and arrange everything properly. She looked up at Colt. Unless you've changed your mind about marrying me, not a chance. The words came easily, without hesitation. But are you sure? After everything that's happened, after— Colt Merrick, if you ask me one more time if I'm sure about marrying you, I'm going to hit you with something heavy. But she was smiling, that brilliant smile that transformed her whole face. I love you, I choose you, and I'm not changing my mind, so you might as well accept it. I love you too. He said it for the first time, and it felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely right. I should have said it before, should have told you every day since I rode into this town. I love you, Rosalind Hayes, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth the risk you took on me. She kissed him then, right there in the street with half of Birch Hollow watching, and Colt forgot about the trial and the suspended sentence and everything except the feel of her in his arms and the knowledge that somehow, against all odds, he'd found his way home. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Colt reported to Sheriff Hendricks as required, giving detailed information about Jake Hollis's operations, his known associates, the places he liked to camp. Federal marshals came through twice, taking statements and promising to coordinate a manhunt. Colt knew Jake wouldn't be easy to catch. The man was too smart, too careful, but at least he'd done what he could to help. He also threw himself into work, determined to prove to the judge and the town that he was serious about building a legitimate life. He took on every odd job offered, mending fences, repairing roofs, building additions, shoeing horses. The work was hard and honest, and at the end of each day he fell into bed exhausted but satisfied in a way he'd never been after a robbery or a con. Rosalind continued teaching, but in the evenings they'd sit on her porch and plan their future. Small things mostly, where to put the new bookshelf Colt was building, what vegetables to plant in the garden, how to combine their lives into something that worked for both of them. "I want to keep teaching," she told him one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I know Pastor Williams thinks I should focus on being a wife, but then you'll keep teaching." Colt took her hand. "I told you before, I'm not going to ask you to give up something that matters to you. Your students need you. Some people will talk. Let them talk. We've survived worse than gossip." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Besides, I like that you're independent, that you have your own life and interests. It means I get to discover new things about you all the time." She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and easy. "You know, when Thomas and I were married, it was very traditional. He made the decisions, handled the money, told me what we'd do and when. I loved him, but sometimes I felt like I was living someone else's life instead of my own. And with you, I feel like I'm building something new, something that doesn't fit into anyone's expectations except ours." She tilted her head to look at him. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Colt wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "I spent 15 years living according to other people's expectations. The gangs, Jake's, whatever identity I'd created in whatever town I was hiding in. I'm done with that. From now on, I just want to be myself with you, however messy or complicated that turns out to be." Messy and complicated sounds perfect. Sarah arrived the week before the wedding, bringing news from back east and a trunk full of gifts from relatives who couldn't make the trip. She'd taken to calling Colt Uncle Colt with such naturalness that it made his throat tight every time. This young woman, who had every reason to fear him, instead treated him like family, like someone who belonged. "Aunt Rosalind's happy," Sarah told him one afternoon while helping him work on the house. "Happier than I've ever seen her. You're good for her." "I hope so." Colt measured a board, marking where he'd need to cut. "I'm trying to be. That's all anyone can do." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then added, "My parents weren't sure I should come back here. They thought it was too dangerous being around someone with your history, but I told them that you saved my life, and that counts for more than any past mistakes. You didn't have to defend me. Yes, I did, because you defended me when it mattered." She handed him a nail. "Besides, Aunt Rosalind would have my head if I missed her wedding. She's been planning this for 3 weeks, and she's very particular about details." That was an understatement. Rosalind had thrown herself into wedding preparations with the same intensity she brought to teaching, organizing everything down to the smallest detail. The ceremony would be at the church, followed by a reception at the town hall. "Simple but elegant," she'd declared. "Nothing too fancy, but nothing shabby either." The night before the wedding, Colt couldn't sleep. He lay in his room at Rosalind's house. His house now, technically, though it still felt strange to think of it that way, and stared at the ceiling, running through everything that could go wrong. Jake could show up with his gang, looking for revenge. Someone could object during the ceremony, citing his criminal past. The judge could change his mind about the suspended sentence. 1,000 disasters, each more unlikely than the last. "Colt?" Rosalind's voice came through the door, soft. "Can I come in?" "It's your house." "It's our house." She opened the door, wearing a nightgown and robe, her hair down around her shoulders. In the moonlight streaming through the window, she looked almost ethereal. "I heard you moving around. Can't sleep?" "Just thinking." "About tomorrow?" She sat on the edge of his bed, and the simple intimacy of it, the ease with which she moved into his space, still amazed him. "Having second thoughts?" "Third and fourth thoughts, maybe, but not about marrying you, about whether I'm going to mess this up somehow." "You probably will." She said it matter-of-factly. "And I'll probably mess it up too. We'll argue about stupid things like how to organize the books, or whether to plant corn or wheat in the back field. You'll forget important dates, and I'll work too late, and we'll both say things we don't mean when we're tired or frustrated. That's not a very romantic view of marriage. No, but it's an honest one. She reached out and touched his face, gentle. I don't need romance, Colt. I don't need grand gestures or perfect behavior. I just need you to keep showing up, keep trying, keep being the man who rode 800 miles because he wanted to be better than he was. Can you do that? Yeah. He covered her hand with his own. Yeah, I can do that. Good. She leaned in and kissed him, not the passionate kisses they'd shared before, but something softer, more intimate, a promise. Now get some sleep. We have a wedding in the morning, and I refuse to have bags under my eyes in the photographs. She left, and Colt lay back down, feeling lighter than he had in years. She was right. He couldn't promise perfection, couldn't guarantee he'd never make another mistake or face another challenge to his resolve, but he could promise to keep trying. And somehow, that was enough. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Colt stood in front of the mirror in his room, fumbling with his collar for the third time. He'd bought a new suit for the occasion, nothing fancy, just clean and respectable, but it felt strange after years of wearing whatever was practical or helped him blend in. Sheriff Hendricks showed up an hour before the ceremony to escort him to the church. Ready? As I'll ever be. Good, because Rosalind's been up since dawn making sure everything's perfect, and if you're late, she'll probably shoot you herself. But Hendricks was smiling. For what it's worth, Merrick, I think you're making the right choice. Both of you are. The church was full when they arrived. Nearly everyone in Birch Hollow had turned out, along with people from neighboring towns who'd heard about the trial and wanted to see how this unlikely romance turned out. Colt stood at the altar next to Pastor Williams, his hands clasped to keep them from shaking, and watched the door. When Rosalind appeared, his breath caught. She was wearing a simple blue dress, nothing like the elaborate white gowns he'd seen in catalog pictures, but somehow more beautiful for its simplicity. Her hair was up, with small white flowers woven through it, and her smile, when she saw him standing there waiting, could have lit up the entire territory. Sarah walked beside her, serving as both bridesmaid and the person giving her away. When they reached the altar, Sarah kissed Rosalind's cheek and whispered something that made her laugh, then took her place to the side. Dearly beloved, Pastor Williams began, and Colt barely heard the words. He was too focused on Rosalind's face, on the way she was looking at him like he was something precious and worth keeping, like he was exactly what she'd been waiting for. The vows were traditional, to love and honor, in sickness and health, for better or worse. But when it came time for Colt to say his part, he found himself adding something unscripted. I promise to keep trying, he said, his voice rough with emotion. To be better today than I was yesterday. To ask for help when I need it, and to trust that you'll be there. To build a life with you that's worth all the risks we've both taken. That's the best promise I can make, and I swear I'll keep it. Rosalind's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. I promise to believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. To fight for us when things get hard. To love you not despite your past, but because of everything it took to get you here. You're worth it, Colt Merrick. You always were. Pastor Williams cleared his throat, clearly moved. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Merrick, you may kiss your bride. Colt pulled Rosalind close and kissed her, and the church erupted in applause. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, he whispered, Hello, Mrs. Merrick. Hello, husband. She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. Ready to start our life? Ready. They walked down the aisle together, through a crowd of well-wishers and thrown rice, out into the brilliant Montana afternoon. The reception was loud and joyful, with more food than seemed possible for a town this size to produce, and dancing that went on until well past dark. Colt found himself laughing more than he had in 15 years, swept up in the celebration and the impossible reality that these people, this town that had every reason to reject him, was welcoming him as one of their own. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Sheriff Hendricks pulled Colt aside. Got word from the federal marshals today. They picked up Jake Hollis and his gang near the Wyoming border. He'll stand trial next month for the payroll attempt and about a dozen other crimes. Colt felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "He say anything?" "Apparently he cursed your name quite colorfully, but he also confirmed your testimony about Kansas City and the other charges that got dropped. Looks like you might get a full pardon on your record once all the paperwork goes through." "I didn't do this for a pardon." "I know, but take it anyway. You've earned it." Hendricks clapped him on the shoulder. "Now get back to your wife. She's probably wondering where you disappeared to." Colt found Rosalind saying goodbye to the last few guests, thanking them for coming, promising to stop by soon. When she saw him, her whole face lit up, and he marveled again at the fact that she was his, that this brilliant, stubborn, beautiful woman had chosen him despite everything. "Ready to go home?" she asked, taking his hand. "More than ready." They walked through the quiet streets of Birch Hollow, past the mercantile and the school, and all the places that had become familiar over the past month. The night was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Stars spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet, and Colt thought about all the nights he'd spent sleeping rough, looking up at those same stars and wondering if he'd ever find peace. When they reached the house, Rosalind paused on the porch. "You know what I realized today?" "What's that?" "This is the first time in 3 years that I've been truly happy. Not content, not resigned, not making the best of things. Actually, genuinely happy." She turned to face him. "Thank you for that." "I'm the one who should be thanking you." Colt pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You saved me, Rosalind. From Jake, from my past, from myself. I know I've got a long way to go still, but we've got a long way to go," she corrected. "Together. That's the deal, remember?" "Together," he agreed. "Always." She kissed him then, slow and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart and went inside, into their home, their life, their future, Colt Merrick felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years of running and hiding and surviving. He felt like he'd finally come home. The years that followed weren't easy. There were challenges and setbacks, moments when Colt's past threatened to resurface, times when the weight of trying to be better felt almost too heavy to bear. But there were also triumphs. Watching Rosalind's students graduate and move on to bigger things. The first time someone called him by name in the street without suspicion or fear. The day Judge Pierce officially pardoned his record, citing his cooperation in bringing Jake Hollis to justice and his exemplary behavior during probation. 5 years after the trial, on a crisp autumn morning, Colt and Rosalind stood on their porch watching the sunrise. She was reading a letter from Sarah, who'd become a teacher herself and was opening a school for girls back east. He was drinking coffee and thinking about the fence that needed mending before winter. "Do you ever miss it?" Rosalind asked suddenly. "The excitement, the danger, the life you had before." Colt considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, knowing exactly who I was, even if that person wasn't good. But then I look at what I have now, and there's no comparison. This life, with you, with this town, with the work I do, this is real in a way nothing before ever was. Even when it's boring?" "Especially when it's boring," he smiled. "Turns out boring is exactly what I needed." She laughed and leaned against him, and they stood like that for a long time, watching the sun climb higher and paint the world in shades of gold. In the distance, the church bell rang, calling people to Sunday service. Children's voices carried on the wind. Somewhere a dog barked, and Mrs. Chen opened the mercantile for the day. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. And for Colt Merrick, who'd spent half his life running from one disaster to another, it was perfect. He'd been too wild for the town once, too dangerous, too unpredictable, too marked by violence and mistakes. But Rosalind Hayes had seen something worth saving, had fought for him when he couldn't fight for himself. And in doing so, she'd tamed not his spirit, but his fear. Had shown him that home wasn't a place you found, but something you built, day by day, choice by choice, with someone who believed you were worth the effort. The stranger who'd ridden into Birch Hollow, like a storm, had finally found peace. And if that peace came with a strong-willed wife who regularly reminded him to hang up his coat and never let him get away with half-truths, well, that was exactly as it should be. Some wild hearts needed taming, others just needed someone brave enough to love them as they were. Colt Merrick had found both, and he'd never been more grateful for anything in his life.